Hi all, thanks for joining. We're just going to take 1 or 2 minutes to make sure all our participants are on the call. So just hang on with us 1 or 2. Okay, great. I think let's get started. I'm just going to turn on my video. So we've got all the speakers here, so let's just kick off. First of all, just thank you for being here today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Natalie Beinisch, and this is the first of a series of 6 sessions that is focusing on circular economy and entrepreneurship. And it's looking at entrepreneurship from a perspective of improving business service provision. So we're happy to launch our first workshop today as part of the World Circular Economy Forum, and we're doing this in partnership with Africa Circular Economy Network and Footprints Africa. So the fundamental question that we're asking across these workshops is, what can we do as a community of incubators, investors, researchers, and entrepreneurs better or differently to deliver to the needs of circular economy entrepreneurs? And these workshops grow from an informal research group that has been addressing circular economy issues in Africa for the last couple of years. And so there's a couple of things to note about the structure based on this. Firstly, we want these workshops to push the boundaries of the way that we think. And we want to look at persistent challenges from different perspectives. So this, I think, is a fundamental principle of research that we're carrying over from these workshops. I think secondly, the workshops are intended to strengthen the conversation between research and industry. And this is because universities play a critical role in business service provision. They're where R&D happens, and they're important knowledge and training institutes. But knowledge can only go so far if business needs are not fully understood. So without further ado, I present the topic of today's workshop, which is a debate on the investability of circular business models. And we've chosen this topic to begin with because everyone likes to talk about money. But more importantly, what we want to think about is how circular economy startups can successfully raise capital. And reflecting on the model of entrepreneurship and innovation today, it's built on a tradition of software innovation.
Oui.
Sorry, if you can mute yourself when you come in. So it's built on a tradition of software innovation. So there's an assumption that you can go from an idea generation to revenue in like 6 to 10 weeks. But circular economy is not like this. So tech is fundamental to circular business models, but circular business models are really built on linkages and relationships in the value chain that can take years to build. And on top of this, circular business models are by definition closed. So in this sense, scalability of a business model that's discouraging material consumption really needs more interrogation. And that's really the discussion of the context of our debate today. And so just in terms of the debate structure, We have the brilliant Yasmin Osage, who's a manager of Manufacturing Africa, which facilitates investment in green businesses in Nigeria, representing the yes position on this topic, that circular business models are investable and should be and scalable. She's going to be presenting and opening yes position, which is going to be followed by the equally fantastic Adun Okupe, who is a lecturer at Lagos Business School, a circular business model expert, and who's been working with circular businesses from a startup to the corporate stage on this topic as well. She's presenting the no position. Yasmin is then going to give a rebuttal, which is going to be followed by Adun. And then we are going to have some questions, some interrogation from our expert judge, who is Anastasia Guha, the head of ESG at and sustainable finance at Reddington Capital in London. Following this, we'll open the discussion and the debate to questions to everyone, and we'll close with a vote. First, a judgment by our expert judge. And then a closing vote to see who the winner of this debate will be. So without further ado, I'm handing it over to Yasmin to open with the yes position. Circular business models are indeed investable. Over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. And you were breaking for part of that. So if my internet breaks off, please let me know. I may have to switch Wi-Fi or take off my camera. So good afternoon, everyone. Great to be part of this really exciting forum and platform. As Natalie explained, I will be representing the yes position, that circular economy business models can be evaluated based on the capacity to scale. Maybe I'll start by briefly introducing myself. My name is Yasmin Osage. I'm the country coordinator for a UK government funded program called Manufacturing Africa. We support companies that are trying to raise capital in the manufacturing and agribusiness space with free transaction facilitation services, investor readiness support, linking with investors that we hope will eventually give them the capital that they need for their projects. In terms of how we interface with the circular economy ecosystem and businesses operating under the circular economy business models, as a result of our increasing focus on green manufacturing, we believe Nigeria's manufacturing sector can support both climate and economic development goals by not only reducing its own footprint through greening existing industries, but then also increasing circularity, creating the products that we need, and the alternative green industries that we need to decarbonize Nigeria's highest emitting sectors. So with that being said, going into this debate on scale, from a Manufacturing Africa perspective, we typically support companies raising $10 million or above in capital. We do revise this down to $5 million for nascent sectors, but the ability to scale undoubtedly is at the heart of what we look for when assessing companies for support. And what we're really trying to do there is mirror the criteria that most investors that we engage with will typically also look for. Scale for us in the broader sense is a company's ability to increase its revenue exponentially whilst utilizing minimal resources such as time, money, and people. And to be clear, with the exception of maybe multinational corporations, which are already dominant market players, we don't expect the companies we support to already be at scale, but we do assess their ability to scale. And key questions that we usually ask, what's the company's historic growth rate? How critical is the product or service that they're offering to the sector? And what's the size of the overall market? What's the competitive positioning of the company? How capable is the management team to drive and accelerate growth once that investment has been secured? What levers are that company relying on, such as technology, to have a greater chance of scaling? And whilst clearly it's important to recognize that stage, the stage that the company is in, and the timelines for scale obviously are quite long term. For us, we need to be sure, and investors need to know that a company can survive. A Harvard Business School report revealed that 50% of startups fail after 5 years of launch, 70% fail after 10 years. So, the ability to know, or, that reassurance that a company can survive is definitely utmost important to investors. So My arguments for why scale is important fall under 3 categories. These are partnerships, risks, and identifying winners. So let me take partnerships as the first one. And I think I say this over and over again when speaking to entrepreneurs. Seeking partnerships as a way to increase your reach and drive your growth, disproportionate to your resource, has to be the #1 priority for a startup. And I think this is even more relevant in a circular economy context, where the goal is often to combine or loop several separate value chains, and companies can't be expected to be experts in each of these. So scale forces companies to think about broadening their reach and impact, and leaning on partners in order to realistically and efficiently expand within the limits of their own resources. And I think this in turn is a big driver for innovation. So in Nigeria here, we supported an electronic waste recycler who had quite successfully leveraged a number of partnerships to evolve their business model from electronic waste recycling into creation of second life products. And this is a process that I had embarked on with support of academic institutions, equipment manufacturers, other social enterprises that were operating in the same ecosystem, international companies that were doing something similar, that were also seeking local partners, development partners such as ourselves. And when assessing this transaction, these partnerships point to the ability of that company to access expertise beyond its own resources and to adequately problem solve when faced with risks and challenges. And I think it just points to the fact that that company has a global view when it comes to thinking about its business beyond its own operations and beyond the Nigeria borders. And so that business owner was already considering how to leverage partners to multiply the success of the project, and a mindset to scale really drove this, which in turn helped them to create truly innovative solutions. So then the second point after partnerships is then risks. And backing a scalable business minimizes the risk for an investor. I don't think that's anything that any of us can deny. And it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. Investors want to be sure that they achieve the objectives of their investment. Primarily and typically, this is a pure economic play, which is a return on investment. But for impact and ESG focused investors, it can also be a focus on numbers, numbers of people impacted, numbers of people reached, number of jobs created, number of emissions reduced. And ultimately, from the view of an investor, a scalable business will have less operating risk than one where scalability is limited. Market share can be captured more quickly by scalable businesses. The company is more resilient. And from an investor perspective, they can make the best use of the investment time horizon and have a view to a successful exit. Venture capitalists and some angel investors are essentially unicorn hunters. They expect only a few of their investments to be successful, and backing the more scalable ones and evaluating scalability helps them to identify these. And from my viewpoint, supporting a number of companies to raise capital in the Nigerian context, investments in first movers that have demonstrated abilities to scale are good for the industry as a whole. They create positive investment signals for other investors. And when speaking to investors on the Manufacturing Africa program, the first question we usually get on a transaction is, who else has invested in this company and who else has invested in this space? And in some of the nascent circular economy sectors, this is critical. It shows that there is a valid opportunity. And it also allows other investors to invest in companies perhaps at a smaller amount or an earlier stage. So Kaltani is a good example of this in the plastic recycling space. They secured $4 million in seed funding earlier this year to expand their recycling operations, and they have really big ambitions. And this can also be applied regionally. And we've supported a successful insect-based animal feeds company to reach financial close in Kenya. And because of their success, investors were interested in emerging companies here in Nigeria that they may otherwise not have paid attention to. So then the third point for me is then around scale being a good way to identify the natural winners and eliminate less efficient enterprises. And I can see I'm running a little bit out of time here, but the reality is that not all companies will scale. If investors evaluate the potential scalability of a company, but it may never materialize. And that's something that they're quite well aware of. But having a scalable mindset will drive companies to think about efficiency and sustainability and propel those that are more likely to succeed in doing so. So in summary, yes, I do believe ability to scale is an important factor in assessing circular economy business models. The investors that we engage with also believe it's an important factor. It forces companies to prioritize partnerships. It helps to minimize risks and results in actual investments that create positive signals for the ecosystem. And it propels the most efficient and sustainable economies or sustainable companies to be more successful. So I'll hand over to Adun now for her no position, and then I'll come back on my rebuttal. Thanks for listening.
Okay, so hello everyone and good afternoon. So thank you for being here. My name is Adun Okukwe, and I am a member of faculty at Lagos Business School, where I teach in circular economy, sustainability for innovation and leadership. And I also advise businesses and clients in terms of investments, particularly looking in the tourism industry and the creative economy. So that's kind of what I do. And my argument really, and I guess it's not really an argument, but my point of view is looking that scalability should not be a factor in investment evaluation for circular economy business models. And I think that it's important I know we all understand what circular economy means, but when we think about the business model for circularity, right, it's looking at how organizations are trying to solve problems in a way that we look at product ownership, looking at how we can reimagine that, looking at how we can redefine product life extension, and also how we can design for recycling and also for reducing waste. And so I think it's important that when we look at the purpose of circular economy business models, right, and we see them within the context of Nigeria, a developing economy challenge, the most important thing is innovation, is experimenting, is being able to be agile, and is being also able to focus on testing. And when you think about scalability, which is actually adding pressure to founders to really think about, exponential growth, right? That pressure will limit the ability to which they're able to focus on, experimenting, looking at how they can come up with more innovative solutions. And it's also important because, context matters. A solution that can work in a context might not also work in another context. And so pressure is one thing that I would say that looking for investment and investors looking for scalability, pressure is something that it adds to the founders, and that is not quite good, particularly when you're thinking about initial startup phase. So of course, depending on the phase of the organization, then the scalability conversation can be had, but it should not be a factor, particularly for the startup phase. And the other thing as well is that there is a significant difference between an organization that is growing and an organization that is trying to scale, right? So growing means that you're solving more problems, you're having more customers, you're also able to meet more people's needs. And this is where the focus should be. To what extent is this solution addressing needs in the marketplace? To what extent can it grow? And it is normal to see that if an organization is growing, right, it also needs to invest in more resources. And so the investment, right, will not necessarily be that sense of scalability, which means that when you're providing when you're having one factor of growth, one factor of business or investment or resources, then you're going to have X factor of growth. No. So we're saying that you can grow and that there should be a way or rate of growth that is sustainable. And, I'll go back to what Yasmin said, right? In terms of startup failure, premature scaling is the reason for failure of 70% of startups. So that's evidence that scalability doesn't necessarily work and that this pressure will actually impede on the growth of the business model, of the businesses. And the other part of my argument is looking at what the focus for circular businesses should be on and how investment can really help to help in terms of the effective design of processes, right? And also the metrics that govern these will also vary depending on the industry and the output. For example, if we're looking at more products, right, and we see that we want to expand on more products, right, it is normal to assume that you wouldn't necessarily be able to scale immediately, right? Services to some extent are easier to scale, depending, of course, if they're as well digital services. But if they're people focused and people centric and they're employing more people, then that is going to be a bit more challenging to scale. And it's good to realize that what we don't want is we don't want to dissuade and discourage people from providing solutions simply because they have to prove scalability very early on. Scalability doesn't necessarily apply to all business models. And I guess it also is important to say that, at what stage then can we think about scalability? I would say that for investors, I would encourage my investors to look more for a long-term strategy. Once the proof of concept has been defined, once we have seen that there's a fit between the product and the market, once we have also seen that there's a growth model, right? Because we always hear of, startups that have raised, funds, and then later on they have to fire people, they have to reduce people because they've seen that they cannot sustain the model in which they have started. So what we want, yes, we have portfolio mix and risk can be diversified, but it's important that we're also trying to be very smart about the risks that we're also undertaking. And then I would say, I guess that in terms of the final point, right? The first point was pressure. The second point was allowing experimentation to happen and to allow growth to happen naturally. The third point is that when we're thinking about investment evaluation, there are other factors that you have to think about. You have to think about, organic growth. You have to think about timelines, customer feedback, sales, marketing and communications. All of these other things that we need to consider are going to be ignored or not given the importance they deserve because organizations are focused on scalability. And so I would say that investors should really be looking for more evidence of organic growth, more clarity on timelines and projections, ability to maintain customer service, ability to also maintain the quality, right, that has been promised. And then it's only at that point when that has been consistently proven and there is some sort of market trust and leadership that we can then invite the scalability conversation. And so the question then for me, and I'll pass it over to Yasmin, is to say that there's nothing wrong with thinking about scalability, but it shouldn't be the main factor. And it definitely should not be the factor for investment evaluation when you're thinking about investing in startups, because the circular economy business model, right, needs to be sustainable. And it's important that we are rewarding experimentation, innovation, agility, and testing. Thank you.
Thank you, Arjun. Yasmin, are you ready for your rebuttal?
I am. Apologies, I was having some network. So thank you so much, Arjun, and I do agree with a number of your points. I think I have 2 points in terms of the rebuttal, and this is the first one around this growth versus scale. I agree that the primary focus for any startup, circular economy or otherwise, is to establish themselves in the marketplace, is to ascertain, get through that pilot process and to make sure that they actually have a valid business model that the ecosystem positively responds to. But I would disagree with scale being something that is left until after growth has been achieved. Where a business does have the ability to scale, having this built into the strategy and at the forefront of the founders' minds from the outset often makes it easier to do so when the time is right. And I think that's definitely one point we agree on, that it's a matter of timing, and scaling too early on is often the cause of a lot of startups' failure. If a company is thinking about scale from the outset, it can help them to concentrate on the entire customer journey, thinking about ways that each touch point can be optimized. And most businesses do exist to provide a solution to a problem, particularly in the circular economy space, and having a purely growth mindset will force them to prioritize survival. And typically what we see is that startups' gross profit levels are low, which of course is fine in the initial stages, but as they seek to expand and utilize more resources in order to do so, we see that their gross profit levels remain low. They haven't thought about how to improve their impact or revenues faster with minimal resources. And one thing I will say, Arjun, is that, and I admit, a startup that is focused on scale is rare. of the 20 transactions that we've supported in Nigeria, only one was truly thinking about scale. You know, at seed round, they were already analyzing increasing in recurring revenue or IRR, exploring franchising as a model to expand into new markets with minimal setup costs. But the reality is, that company, compared to others that we've supported in the sector, is more likely to get funding than the others. And we need to push startups to think more about scale earlier on as a way to accelerate a lot more quickly. And I think the second point I would then make in response, Adun, is that I believe, and I know it's one thing I say often, that scale is actually particularly important to the circular economy context. So circular economy business models have really given us a pathway towards achieving climate goals, you know, tackling greenhouse gas emissions tied to consumption of goods. We're currently, you know, seeing a really strong momentum, increasing traction for circular economy. Global corporations are coming on board, policymakers and governments are paying attention. But the reality is, we're very behind globally, but then actually, especially in emerging markets such as Nigeria. And I think I would challenge us to explore a wider and more diverse range of business models, to explore perhaps even combining business models where applicable, seeing how we can open up new markets and bring even more environmental benefits. And I think the plastic recycling value chain in Nigeria is a good example of this. So we have a number of smaller players, each truly doing remarkable things, you know, but the problem is they're working in silos. They're using a great level of individual resource in order to collect, sort, process. Have we explored clustering? You know, what partnership models can be utilized to expand reach? We need to challenge ourselves to think bigger in order to have the desired impact that we want in the sector. Back over to you, Adam.
All right, thanks, Yasmin. And I agree with you in that scalability thinking is very important, but that's very different from, you know, the scalability that we're talking about here, which is showing evidence in that the solution that is being provided can be scalable. And it's important that being able to think about scalability, right, is necessary, because when you're trying to grow a business, you also want to ask yourself the question whether scalability is even what you want or even what you need. For some businesses, right, and for some sectors, that's not necessarily how they need to grow. And I think that the similar capitalist mindset that you must constantly grow is what the circular economy is trying to fight against. So in that sense, we agree, but I would disagree that you have to always prove scalability for every business decision. I think the other point that I would like to make is that when a founder is starting a business, right, the type of capabilities that are required for that business to thrive and to grow, right, it is very different from when you're running a business that has scaled or that needs to be scaling. And in some cases, we hear of CEOs they're able to raise funding as the second, rounds of funding, and then they have to be voted out because they don't have the capability to continue to run the business and the organization. And looking at what the message that sends is, again, going back to pressure, is that if we're trying to grow sustainable businesses, to what extent are we also equipping these people to think about the right type of leadership capabilities, the right type of management structures that they need to have? And so when investors are thinking about scalability, or when they're thinking about investing, right, I would say that it's more important to think about these capabilities and these management structures and processes than to really start to think about scalability for scalability's sake, because not every business needs to scale. The other point that I would like to make, it still comes back again to the earlier point that growth is different from skill, and that you can have growth and you can, have returns for your investors. And that when you're thinking about growth and when you're working with investors, right, looking and focusing on the quality, looking and focusing on long-term demand and building that strong level of impact within the sphere of where you're operating, I would say it's much more important than simply having multiple outlets or multiple franchises or multiple partnerships. And now when we talk about partnerships, and I think you make a very important point, which I agree with, I would say that partnerships are quite important, and that's different from the scalability conversation. So partnerships, I would say, are key, because across the value chain of wherever the business is trying to operate, it's important that you're able to find other partners that can work with you. And that actually removes the pressure, right, from the founder to think of, I have to provide all of these things across the value chain. I have to scale to meet all of these needs. So I would say we agree in terms of partnership, but partnerships can work for growth. It doesn't have to be for scaling. Thank you.
Thank you so much for two very strong arguments for and against scalability, or investing purely for scalability in circular business models. I'm struggling to find a position given these arguments. So we're now going to move to our expert judge to ask some questions. I'm just going to remind, we're also going to open the questions to the audience, but I'm going to remind the audience that the questions should be focused on helping you inform your decision making about whether you agree with Yasmin's position or not. There's some other comments in the chat that are very, very interesting, and I think would make some great material for some further discussion that are not necessarily focused on this particular question. So I'm going to hand over to you, Anastasia, to ask your opening questions to Yasmin and Adun.
Thanks, Natalie, and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Adun, Yasmin. I thought that was really well done. I really understood your positions, and there really was a debate about scalability. I just want to take a quick second to explain where I'm coming from, the institution that I represent. So I am an investment consultant based out of London, looking after sustainable investors who have about 600 billion assets under management. So a big sort of group of investors, and many of them are looking for solutions to be able to meet their net zero targets, especially in the developing world. The question of scalability for them is interesting because these are the size of deals that just wouldn't work in VC is problematic, Series A, B, or C, let alone seed. So but there's an understanding now, finally, that looking for those unicorns that have become entirely recognized, for instance, in their local markets, and then coming in with foreign capital and supporting them can't be the way forward, that there has to be more work at an earlier stage. So to Yasmin, a specific question on partnerships. How in your model does an investor look at partnerships for scale? Usually when you look at a firm that's done partnerships, it's through acquisitions or through mergers, because otherwise how do you do revenue sharing? Because at the end of the day, it has to make sense from a financial perspective. How would you characterize that within your scale model?
And thank you, Anastasia. So for us, we have quite a broad view, and we support a range of different investors, right from DFIs to impact investors, VCs, PE houses, and we do take quite a broad view when it comes to thinking about partnerships. I think I'd probably categorize partnerships under maybe three broad models. So the first being technical partnerships, and I think this is quite important for the Nigerian context and for the sub-Saharan context. We are almost playing catch up, and there is a need, to tap into academic institutions and people that have the knowledge and know-how to help startups to accelerate their learning and to create solutions quite quickly. So we have fantastic minds all across sub-Saharan Africa. We have entrepreneurs that are doing, truly amazing things. But in a lot of instances, there's rarely an example where there's not a global best practice example of how it's been done elsewhere and how a company has been able to significantly grow within that sector in another country or in another geography. So I think technical partnerships are really important, and startups leveraging technical partnerships to leapfrog solutions and to create solutions a lot more quicker, and then looking at a global best practice as a way to do this. I think the other thing then is peer-to-peer, and I think I kind of hinted to this when I spoke about the plastic value chain. Peer-to-peer partnerships are very important multipliers this silo mentality that we have, a number of different small SMEs doing the same thing, replicating it, but utilizing a lot of different resources to do so, is where the peer-to-peer partnerships really comes in. It gives startups in the circular economy space that multiplier to allow them to have a larger reach, and to allow them to have a greater impact. And I think the final one is then financial partnerships. And this obviously takes many, many forms. Different companies in different stages of their growth will reach out for different types of financial partnerships. But I think those financial partnerships do have an important role to play to make sure companies come out of that initial startup phase, complete their pilots, are able to get their seed funding. And I think DFIs in particular have a really, really important role to play. Angel investors have a really important to play. And it really is unfortunate that the angel investment network here in Nigeria is so underdeveloped, but those financial partnerships are critical, and really allow companies to test and pilot and push the successful business models that larger investors, such as the ones that you're representing, can then come and support. So I'd say, yeah, we think about partnerships really under three models. So we're really thinking about technical partnerships, we're thinking about peer-to-peer partnerships that will multiply impact, and then we're thinking about financial partnerships as well.
That's very helpful, thank you. And just as a sort of anecdote there, this week I've been working with an investor that put some money into a fund which is based out of France and looks only in the developed markets, but has a very, very strong set of plastics-based technical partnerships. So it's absolutely critical that continues. I totally agree with that, because as you were saying, and in fact, it's something that maybe perhaps your universities and some others could franchise those models if they come up with some good ideas that works in different climates, for instance, that doesn't work for the developed world. Adun, question for you on scalability. It seemed to me that your intervention was really about scalability puts too much pressure on an entrepreneur, and it leads to more likelihood of not developing and giving that sort of free mindset many entrepreneurs have to be able to do this. My question to you is, without the ambition to scalability and growth are two sort of sides of the same coin to my mind. Without that ambition, can a startup really develop?
Oh, that's a very good question. Thanks, Anastasia. And I would say that, again, having a growth mindset, I think it's very different from a scalability mindset, right? And I think that when you're in a developing economy context where you're iterating and you're testing solutions, right? You don't know what these solutions are. Our problems are tough and wicked, and in that sense, the solution isn't already known. I think that when you're trying to come up with investment, right? The question for me, or how I see it, is that if I cannot prove that I can scale, does that mean that I shouldn't get investment, right? And I think that the answer to that is no. So one thing to say, is there a proof of concept? Can you sustain this business? Can you sustain this growth, right? It's very different from saying that, oh, we want to ensure that we can continue to grow revenue without also adding to the resources that are going to be employed. Because just by the sheer nature of how things operate, both in the rural and the urban economies, right? We see that it's quite challenging to have a one-size-fits-all model, and in many cases, scalability does require that one-size-fits-all model. So an example I'd like to give is tourism, right? I do a lot of work with tourism investors, and we look at resorts, right? You see a resort in a rural area that you need to think about. You need to think about the business model, have an investment case for, etc. When you have to think about scaling that, that's really going to affect, the entire business model and the livelihoods of that particular area that you're thinking about. So in that case, what we have to show, and what we do show to investors, is that this business model is viable, is profitable, it can be sustained over the long term. And then perhaps once we have seen that, we can think about then exporting it or looking at how to adapt that solution somewhere else. I just find that in many cases, when we think about scalability, it's this sense of you can do this for 10 people and you need to start to be able to do it for 100, 1,000, 10,000 people immediately. And that will affect the type of solutions. So what I'm asking is perhaps rather than, kind of not forcing, but rather than, and it is forcing in a way, because whatever is rewarded is what the market responds to. And it's saying that when we start to look at other types of reward, so that we're just not missing out on founders that really want to make a difference, simply because the solutions are not necessarily scalable.
I think you make a very, very interesting point. And one of the, I know I'm supposed to pick sides, but one of the things that I'm starting to think the more I hear both of you make your incredibly compelling arguments is that there are different types of capital that work with different types of founder mindsets. And perhaps there's a type of capital that works with Yasmin's founder mindset, and that's really about a different type of ambition. And there's a type of capital that works with your mindset, which is more in some ways the kind of old school debt financing to small scale enterprises type of, maybe not, you're shaking your head, but maybe we rephrase it, but a different type of capital works with you. And it's almost like the capital chooses who they want to align to, and there are two different tracks for them. Perhaps that's something, and I can see that, genuinely I can see that working, not at the scale that I work in perhaps, but for investors who are operating to not lose money, I can see how they would understand that two-track approach. So maybe that's a solution. But Natalie, I don't know about time. Are we running out?
I'm going to open the floor to a couple of questions while you deliberate on your expert opinion of yes or no. And we have some questions typed in the chat. I'm going to try and synthesize a couple of them. At that point, after which we get these answers to these questions, I will have the poll out, and Anastasia, while the poll is running, you'll have to execute your judgment. So one of the questions, the synthesis of the question in the chat, I hope I'm going to do it justice, but it came up a few times, is around the informal sector, because the circular business models really do incorporate this the informal sector. So I guess the question is how can we think about investing or inclusion of informal sector and in the context of this discussion around scalability? And I would just ask Adun and Yasmin for their thoughts on this topic.
Okay, I'll go first, and I think that's a fantastic question, and that represents a lot of the reality of what we have on ground, which is that 70% of the business activities in terms of enterprise really isn't in the formal sector, and it's important to realize that. And just to say, I completely agree what Anastasia was saying in terms of different types of capital, but shouldn't we be encouraging patient capital and more sustainable capital? There's nothing wrong with an investor having a portfolio, or rather a fund manager having a portfolio of different businesses that show strong growth potential, right? And you can look at doing that in different, because we also know the reality on ground. In terms of the informal sector, in terms of the micro, small enterprises, right? And just the scale, the size of these, right? It's going to be very difficult to bring them up into one, one system and one process to be able to say that this is what we're doing. And I don't want to mention that on this call, but I have many examples of where it hasn't worked. It starts and it dies quickly like a flame on, And so I would say that the focus on growth really does allow for many different informal sector players to work. It also allows for trust, which is one key factor to be built over the long term. And it also allows for changes to be made. And I think that having that capability for change is important. But I guess my final comment would be that clearly, what we want is to see how we can bring more players into the formal sector, right? And perhaps one thing that we can look at is once as founder businesses incorporate more of these informal sector players, they're going to be incorporated within the formal system. And it's not that scalability is wrong or is bad, it's just that it simply shouldn't be the major factor in investment. And so perhaps after proof of concept, viability, development contributions have been proven, then we can start to develop capabilities for the management that can then continue in the direction of scalability if it's required. But starting out from that, it's just not correct. So there are different ways to look at it. And I would say that my point of view really encompasses and incorporates informal sector players. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. Hard to respond to that. Great response. What I would say is that it's almost impossible for an enterprise to succeed without bringing in the informal sector. There's so many advantages that come from companies bringing in the informal sector into their value chains, from skills transfer, health and safety, and standards transfer, helping the informal sector have better livelihoods. So I would say absolutely the informal sector does need to be brought into business models in order for them to succeed. But what I would say is the informal sector operating at these micro levels is not what is going to bring us success and exponential growth in the circular economy ecosystem. We really need to see the combining of the efforts from the informal sector. And I think medium and large scale enterprises really do have a role to play in making this informal sector a lot more successful, in making it a lot more sustainable, and ultimately in improving the livelihoods of a number of the individuals in the informal sector. I'll give an example back to the electronic waste recycler. A number of the people that were collecting the electronic waste in the informal sector were underage children that were exposing themselves to very dangerous chemicals. And by bringing these people into the value chain, they've been able to get a better livelihood. They've been able to transfer improved skills, improved standards, and ultimately what it means, because we need to remember that we're not competing with Nigeria here. We're competing on a global scale, and doing, moving away from like diverse and sporadic, informal clusters of operations to more streamlined operations means that Nigeria is able to compete on a global scale, and that's ultimately what we're being assessed on. So yeah, I would reiterate that bringing in the informal sector is critical, and utilizing them and leveraging what's at the disposal of medium and large scale enterprises is going to be a large part of their success.
Thank you. I'm gonna, there's quite a number of questions in the chat, and my sincere apologies if we don't get to it in this short hour. It doesn't mean that you've been ignored. This is material for future conversations. But I'm just gonna ask 2 more questions, just given the time, to our brilliant debaters. The first comes from Mark Dorval, and he is asking whether it's possible that there's some markets that can only exist with scale, and that there's other markets or other products that that support really organic growth models. And if there's a distinction we can make really from a market or a sector perspective.
Okay, should I go first? Okay, all right. So I think that yes, and that was part of the point I was making, that there are certain products and services, and depending on the business model, that can lend themselves to scale, right? But there are certain other ones that do not lend themselves to scale. So for example, if you're looking at a digital intervention, so for example, software service, it's very easy to scale, because the resources that you need to show that you can collect or aggregate perhaps people responding to a survey or question, and you can expand that and exponentially grow that to 10,000, 1 million. What I'm saying is that there are certain interventions that really do require the additional investment in resources. So for example, if you're looking at recycling, or if you're looking at avenues that you have to think of, look at it in a community's point of view. You want to grow your ability to recycle, then it's going to be important that you also grow the ability to collect it, right? And bringing in more factors, right? More resources will not necessarily lead you to the exponential increase in revenue that scalability requires. But does that mean, therefore, that we shouldn't collect waste in communities and contribute to SDGs and of clean water and sanitation? Of course not. So what we're saying is certain products and certain services at different timelines can be more attractive to scalability, but there are others that are not. And particularly where, you have, and I'm just continuing with waste because waste is something that I've done quite a bit of work in, right? You have certain models that have come up and they've not been able to sustainably thrive without patient capital and also grants, simply because the scaling funding model doesn't work for them. And so it's that pressure between ensuring that you have, the awareness in the community areas, you have the knowledge that you're developing, you have the people that you're training, you have the resources and investments in machinery, etc. Right? Those are investments that we do need investors for, right? And just because we cannot prove immediately that you can do the same thing 1 million times without, investing significant costs, doesn't mean you shouldn't have those interventions. So I guess I'll go back to, it's really about what type of product or what type of service, what type of development challenge. And it's important that we encourage more innovative solutions and not burden founders with the need to prove scalability earlier on, because that will cost in terms of the quality and what they are able to deliver to us. And we're missing out in terms of solving our challenges.
Maybe I'll just come in briefly to say I actually agree. I think that it's not every market that gives itself to being scaled. My argument is that where it is a sector that does open itself up to being scaled, you have to move away from grants and early stage funding. You have to tap into the larger capital that will allow you to exponentially develop and expand into new products, new sectors, new markets. So absolutely, if it's a sector that doesn't give itself a way to being scaled, then that this kind of capital is not the right capital for it. But a lot of the sectors that we're talking about in the circular economy space in Nigeria, I mean, if we think about plastic recycling, insect-based feeds, textiles, recycling and using sustainable sources for textiles, these do give themselves to being scaled, especially because of the size of the Nigerian market. The market is huge, and investors that come to Nigeria are aware that the market is huge. So having all these players operating at a micro scale doesn't align with the size of the market opportunity. So I would say that sectors that can be scaled and cannot remain at, just being grant funded. They do have to think larger, think bigger, think about other market opportunities. Otherwise, we're doing ourselves a disservice, and we're never really going to truly move the needle when it comes to circular economy in Nigeria.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask one last closing question from the chat. Make this a 30-second wrap up for your final fight to win the battle. So this question is related to impact investment and whether we should see these two kinds of approaches as distinct or the same from one another. 45 seconds each. Go, Yasmin.
I think, this distinction between impact investment and more profit focused in investment is starting to merge. What we're actually seeing is more conscious capitalism, and Anastasia has mentioned that she's sitting on a huge fund where investors globally are thinking more about sustainability and thinking more about impact of their investments. And I think that the distinction between the two is almost false, and we're going to increasingly see more traditional financing vehicles that have a focus on impact. I don't think we're the role of impact investment is, or the role of investing in businesses that are more impact focused is just left to impact investors alone. I think we're definitely going to see a convergence rather, and I think conscious capitalism really is the future of investing.
Okay, all right. A few years ago, I did a project and I wrote a book on looking at Afro-capitalism and the role of business in development. And a lot of that is saying that, you know, the fact that we're not looking at scalability doesn't also mean that the size of the investment cannot be large, right? We know of a lot of healthcare interventions that have tried to show the scalability example. They've tried to have the scalability story, and then they have really not succeeded because they've seen that in Nigeria it's quite peculiar, and that it's important that you again have a workable solution. And so impact investment, like Yasmin says, is converging, right, in terms of also more traditional types of investment. And I think it's because, again, it's because of the fact that we've seen failures. We've seen that we have cycles and we have of boom and bust, and we know that that's not sustainable. That's not sending the right message to the market. That's not sending the right message to the founders. We know that people are working huge pressure, burnout, etc. And we know that that's not where we want to go to. And so again, it's just important that we start to really think about how we reward investment, how we think about investment, and that it's really not just always about size. It's, again, like it is about the impact that it can have. And there is a way that you can have sustained impact. And I would argue that sustained impact is perhaps much better than having short-lived, perhaps not even having the impact, but having a short-lived story that really just tells everyone to feel good and then fails. So I would say that it's important that all investment thinks about the impacts they're having, thinks about the positive impact, and also how to mitigate the negative impacts, and that we look at how to ensure that some of this impact is about also driving innovation, research, design that does not necessarily fit into the scalability question immediately. So it's not saying scalability is wrong or wrong. It's just saying that that initial need to prove it immediately might not be in the right incentive. Thank you. And vote for me.
So now we are at judgment time. We're going to get the poll up. So I think Oba is leading the way on setting up the poll. We have to have a drum roll. And while the poll is going, Anastasia, so as not to corrupt the positions or the opinions of our audience at large, will deliver her verdict as the poll is going.
So I'll be quick. And I'm not going to play the game, Natalie, because it's just, I genuinely think this is a spectrum of capital issue. And what that means is there will be those at the start of the spectrum and those at the end of the spectrum. Yasmin speaking my language, this is what I understand where she's coming from, because I represent capital that deals with the spectrum that she's looking at. But I also understand that you have to, we work in a market-based economy, you have to let many flowers bloom. And as a result, some of those will become unicorns and others won't, and that's fine. It'll still bring the development up. I just wanted to leave you with a few. So as I said, as a spectrum of capital issue, we just have to be clear about which part of the spectrum you're investing in and what risk return you expect in that part of the spectrum. And Yasmin's enterprises will get money, and so will Adun's, at least from my vote. And so that's what I would say. The other thing I would say is that it is also incumbent upon those unicorns who are outside of the private markets, who've gone into the public markets as well as government, to start to issue some circular economy focused bonds. We'd be on it like a rash, honestly. So we have to think about more types of financing that others, the larger market that's looking at this. Remember that annual issuance of circular economy bonds from sovereigns and corporates, this is from UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, multiplied by 5 times between 2019 and 2021. I know I have investors today who would be interested in things like that. So we just need to think about the right capital going to the right projects. And now.
Okay, right capital, the right projects. Oh, you got the answer. Okay, let's see. Oba, has the poll closed yet to see what the public thinks, or the audience, if the audience concurs with Anastasia's judgment?
And Oba, I assume I can't vote for myself because you've sent me the poll.
Do we have a final reckoning, Oba?
I'm trying to get as many votes as I can. So we have 25 people who have voted already, and we have about 42 currently on the call. So can you please vote? Can you cast your vote so that we can have a more robust result?
Let's give 20 more seconds to get the final verdict and to have the final the last words from our brilliant team of debatees. I'm waiting on tenterhooks, Oba.
Okay, I'm about to end the poll now. I'm ending it now. Yes. And I've ended the poll. So I'll share the results now.
Oh, is it Adun is coming out the winner? We'll buy you a bottle of wine next time we see you in Lagos. It's a brilliant, that's not to say that all arguments made in this discussion were not formidable. With that, I'm going to leave Adun to maybe make her first set of closing comments, Anastasia to maybe say a couple last items as well. And Yasmin, although you lost the debate, you get the final word.
Okay, thank you. Woo! Thank you. And I have to say that the conversation really is, I mean, we had to take arguments, but it's really about spectrum, like Anastasia said. And thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this opportunity to share some of my thoughts, but also to learn. And I would say that Yasmin made very strong, compelling arguments. And it is important that impact can be scaled, right? And I guess that's the key thing here, is that we're focusing on how to ensure that many more people can have the interventions that will also improve their well-being. So thank you, ladies. I feel like this has been Oba isn't a lady, so I shan't say anything, but thank you, ladies. I've really enjoyed this. Over to you, Anastasia. Thank you.
I won't keep you. I've said everything I have to say. I just wanted to say I really enjoyed that, much more than I was expecting to do. Your arguments were compelling. And actually what I've learned from this, and actually even from the audience poll, is that there is a really big need to sort of democratize the startup culture. And as I said, there will be capital. You just call it what it is, tell everyone what to expect, and there will be capital for that. But I'm sure Yasmin and I will be talking more in the future.
I actually really thoroughly enjoyed this. I think it's been such an interesting way to really like push the boundaries on, you know, some of these discussions that we've had. The reality is that it's difficult for even the most seemingly promising and successful companies that we support in the circular economy space to raise capital. You know, it's really hard. Work has to be done to help investors understand what is needed from social and low profit enterprises in order for the investors to take the risks and to see the return. You know, they need to nurture the talent. They need to provide that support in, you know, helping companies to expand and scale. I know that's, you know, the word that we don't want to use. And then, you know, creating and refining those processes. You know, what we're increasingly seeing is larger investors establishing smaller catalysts and ESG funds that are better equipped to support circular economy and social impact companies. But the evaluation process for these companies still need to be tailored. Programs such as Manufacturing Africa support on the business investor readiness side. And I think there needs to be a lot more work and learning on the investor side as to how best to quantify risk and what type of scalable levers to look out for in a circular economy context, because they're not the same as some other markets. So thoroughly enjoy this, taking me back to my law school days. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you really so much for such as I said, they were really brilliant contributions, which I think from everybody, and I think again on behalf of everybody that's participated today, a huge round of applause and thank you for the efforts, for the and the insights, and I think we have a lot to work with in terms of going forward to push this envelope further and to further advocate support for the entrepreneurs working in this space in Nigeria, but also across Africa as well. And thank you, and until the next session.